The gunshots echoed through the twilight air as Victoria Hayes hitched up her skirts and ran faster than she'd ever run in her 22 years of life. The red and gold of the setting sun painted the sky behind her, but she dared not look back at the angry mob that had driven her from the only town she'd called home for the past year. Victoria's lungs burned as she pushed herself forward, her boots pounding against the hard-packed earth. The bundle of her worldly possessions bounced heavily against her side, slowing her down, but she couldn't bear to part with it. It contained everything she had left: a few clothes, her mother's silver locket, and the $78 she'd saved from her wages at the hotel. She could hear the shouts growing fainter behind her, the twilight shadows stretching longer across the plains of Wyoming territory. It was 1876, and a woman alone in this wilderness had little chance of survival. But staying in Silver Creek meant certain death after what had happened. The accusations, the lies, the betrayal, it all swirled in her mind as she ran. Victoria's foot caught on a rock, sending her sprawling into the dirt. Pain shot through her ankle, but fear drove her back to her feet. The wound on her temple from Marshall Holloway's pistol, but was still bleeding, warm blood trickling down her cheek. She wiped it away with a trembling hand and kept moving, her pace slowed to a desperate limp. The sun was almost gone now, the vast Wyoming landscape disappearing into darkness. In the distance, she could see the outline of the foothills, but knew she'd never reach them before night fell completely. Without shelter, without a horse, without protection, she was as good as dead. The tears finally came then, hot and angry, as she pushed forward. The distant sound of coyotes made her blood run cold. Victoria didn't know which would be worse: being torn apart by wild animals or dragged back to Silver Creek to face the hangman's noose. As full darkness descended, she spotted something in the distance, a flicker of orange against the deep blue of the night. A campfire. Victoria froze, her heart hammering in her chest. It could be anyone: outlaws, natives, or worse, bounty hunters already on her trail. But she had no choice. Her ankle throbbed painfully, and the night was growing colder by the minute. With a deep breath, Victoria limped toward the distant light, ready to beg for mercy or run if needed. As she drew closer, she could make out the silhouette of a man sitting by the fire, his back to her. A horse nickered softly nearby, and the man's head turned slightly at the sound. He wore a wide-brimmed hat, and even in the flickering firelight, she could see the worn leather of his vest and the glint of a rifle resting across his lap. Victoria hesitated at the edge of the firelight. The man hadn't noticed her yet, and she studied him for a moment. He wasn't from Silver Creek; she would have recognized him. His campsite was simple but orderly, with a coffee pot nestled in the coals and a bedroll laid out nearby. She must have made some sound because the man suddenly turned, rising to his feet in one fluid motion, the rifle coming up to his shoulder. "Who's there?" His voice was deep, steady, with no trace of panic despite her sudden appearance. Victoria raised her hands. "Please," she said, her voice breaking. "I mean no harm. I need help." The man didn't lower his rifle, but his stance relaxed slightly as he took in her appearance: the torn dress, the blood on her face, the wild, desperate look in her eyes. "Step into the light," he said, his tone gentler now. Victoria took a tentative step forward, wincing as she put weight on her injured ankle. The firelight illuminated her fully honey-blonde hair falling loose from its pins, dirt-smudged face with a gash at her temple, and clothing that had once been proper but was now ripped and filthy. "You're hurt," the man observed, finally lowering his rifle. "I'm being pursued," Victoria said, glancing nervously over her shoulder. "I was driven out of town at gunpoint. If they find me—" She couldn't finish the sentence. The man's expression hardened. "Who's after you?" "Men from Silver Creek. The marshal, some townspeople." She swallowed hard. "They think I killed someone." A long moment of silence stretched between them. Victoria held her breath, waiting for him to send her away or, worse, hold her until her pursuers arrived. Instead, he gestured toward the fire. "Sit down before you fall down," he said. "My name's Brendan. Brendan Cole." Relief nearly buckled her knees as she limped to the fire and sank down gratefully. "Victoria Hayes," she replied. "Thank you." Brendan moved around the fire, keeping a cautious distance. He was taller than she'd first thought, broad-shouldered with a lean, weathered face that spoke of years under the open sky. Dark hair curled slightly beneath his hat, and his eyes were a striking blue even in the dim light. "You're bleeding," he said, gesturing to her temple. Victoria touched the wound gingerly. "The marshal hit me with his pistol before I ran." Brendan's jaw tightened, but he said nothing. Instead, he retrieved a canteen and a clean bandana from his saddlebag. He poured water onto the cloth and held it out to her. "Clean yourself up. I've got some coffee and beans if you're hungry." Victoria took the damp cloth gratefully, pressing it to her temple. "Why are you helping me?" she asked, unable to keep the suspicion from her voice. In her experience, men rarely offered help without expecting something in return. Brendan settled back down across the fire from her. "I'm not in the habit of turning away injured women being hunted like animals," he said simply. He poured coffee into a tin cup and passed it to her. "Drink. It'll warm you up." Victoria accepted the cup, letting the heat seep into her cold hands. "They won't stop looking for me," she said quietly. "If they find me here, you'll be in danger too." Brendan's mouth quirked up in what might have been a smile. "I can handle myself." He nodded toward the darkness beyond the fire. "And we've got a few advantages. No one's tracking in the dark, and this fire can't be seen from the main trail." Victoria sipped the strong, bitter coffee, feeling its warmth spread through her. "You sound like you've done this before." "Done what?" "Harbored fugitives?" There was a hint of amusement in his voice. "Helped people in trouble," she clarified. Brendan didn't answer immediately. He stirred the beans in the small pot hanging over the fire. "I believe in hearing both sides of a story before making judgments," he said finally. "So why don't you tell me yours? Did you kill someone?" Victoria's hand tightened around the cup. "No," she said firmly, "but I'm being blamed for it." "Who died?" "Jacob Ellsworth. He owned the hotel where I worked." Victoria stared into the fire, memories flooding back. "He was found stabbed to death in his office this morning. His wife immediately accused me." "Why would she do that?" Victoria's cheeks flushed with shame and anger. "Because she believed there was something between her husband and me." "There wasn't," she added quickly. "But Jacob was." Attentive. "And Meredith Ellsworth is not a woman who tolerates what she sees as competition." "And the marshal believed her?" "Marshal Holloway does whatever the Ellsworths want. They own half the town." Victoria's voice turned bitter. "They said they found my hairpin near the body. That I'd been seen arguing with Jacob yesterday. It was enough for them." Brendan served her a plate of beans. They weren't much, but to Victoria, it was the finest meal she'd had in days. She ate slowly, aware of his steady gaze on her. "Thank you," she said when she finished. "I haven't eaten since yesterday." Brendan took her plate. "Get some rest. We'll figure out what to do in the morning." Victoria looked at him in surprise. "You're letting me stay?" "Unless you'd prefer to keep running in the dark," he replied dryly. "No, I just—" Victoria hesitated. "I don't want to bring trouble to your door." "Trouble has a way of finding me regardless," Brendan said. He stood and retrieved an extra blanket from his pack, offering it to her. "Take my bedroll. I'll keep watch." Victoria wanted to refuse, to insist she could sleep on the ground, but exhaustion was overtaking her. She accepted the blanket with a grateful nod and moved to the bedroll. As she settled in, she noticed Brendan checking his rifle and positioning himself where he could see the trail they'd come from. "Why are you really helping me?" she asked softly. Brendan didn't look at her, his eyes scanning the darkness. "Get some sleep, Miss Hayes. Dawn comes early out here." Victoria wanted to press further, but her eyes were already closing, the events of the day catching up with her. The last thing she saw before sleep claimed her was Brendan's silhouette against the stars, a steady, watchful presence in a world that had suddenly turned hostile. When Victoria awoke, dawn was just breaking over the eastern horizon. For a disoriented moment, she couldn't remember where she was or why her body ached so terribly. Then the memories flooded back: Jacob's murder, the accusations, her desperate flight from Silver Creek. She sat up with a start, wincing at the pain in her ankle. Brendan was already awake, crouched by a freshly built fire, coffee brewing in the pot. He looked as if he hadn't slept at all, his blue eyes alert as they met hers. "How's the ankle?" he asked. Victoria gingerly flexed her foot. "Swollen, but I can walk." "Let me see it," Brendan said, moving to kneel beside her. Victoria hesitated, then extended her leg. It wasn't proper, but modesty seemed a foolish concern given the circumstances. Brendan carefully removed her boot and examined her ankle with gentle, calloused hands. Sprained, not broken, he pronounced. We should bind it before you put weight on it. We? Victoria questioned. I appreciate your help, Mr. Cole, but I can't ask you to involve yourself further. Once I'm on my feet, I'll be on my way. Brendan gave her a level look. And go where exactly? The question hung in the air between them. Victoria had no answer. She had no family, no friends outside of Silver Creek, and precious little money. As a woman alone, her options were severely limited. I'll figure something out, she said, more bravely than she felt. Brendan shook his head and returned to the fire to pour coffee. You won't make it 10 miles with that ankle, and the men from Silver Creek will be searching at first light. He handed her a cup. Drink. We need to move soon. We? Victoria repeated, taking the coffee. I'm heading north to Fort Laramie, Brendan said. You can ride with me. The fort has a telegraph office. Maybe someone there can help sort out this mess. Victoria stared at him. Why would you do this? You don't know me. I know enough, Brendan said simply. He began packing up the campsite with efficient movements. I know you're injured and alone. I know men are hunting you without a trial. And I know I couldn't live with myself if I left you here. Victoria wanted to argue, to insist she didn't need his charity, but the truth was, she desperately needed help. Thank you, she said softly. Brendan nodded once, then tossed her a strip of cloth. Wrap your ankle while I saddle the horse. While Victoria bound her ankle, Brendan methodically broke down the camp, erasing all traces of their presence. She watched him work, noting the practiced ease with which he moved. This was clearly a man accustomed to life on the trail. Have you been traveling long? She asked. A few weeks this time, he replied. I've been scouting land up north. Are you a surveyor? A ghost of a smile touched his lips. No, just looking for a place to settle. Alone? The question slipped out before Victoria could stop herself. Brendan's hands paused briefly in their work. Yes, he said simply, and she sensed there was a story there he wasn't ready to share. Once the horse was saddled, Brendan extinguished the fire and scattered the ashes. He helped Victoria to her feet, supporting her weight as she hobbled to where his horse waited a sturdy bay gelding that eyed her warily. This is Rusty, Brendan said, patting the horse's neck. He's not used to carrying double, but he's strong. Victoria reached out a tentative hand to the horse, who sniffed it cautiously before allowing her to stroke his nose. Hello, Rusty, she murmured. I promise I'm not too heavy. Brendan's expression softened slightly. Let me help you up. Before Victoria could respond, his hands were at her waist, lifting her onto the saddle as if she weighed nothing. She gasped in surprise, clutching the saddle horn to steady herself. Brendan checked her position, then swung up behind her with easy grace. Victoria stiffened as his arms came around her to take the reins. She'd never been this close to a man before, and the warmth of his chest against her back was disconcerting. Relax, Brendan said, his breath stirring the hair near her ear. I won't bite. Victoria forced herself to loosen her rigid posture. I'm not accustomed to such proximity. She felt rather than heard his low chuckle. Neither is Rusty, but we'll all manage. With a gentle nudge, Brendan set the horse moving at a steady walk. They headed northwest, away from the trail that led back to Silver Creek. Victoria noticed that Brendan kept to rocky ground when possible, making their trail difficult to follow. Are you expecting pursuit? She asked. Always best to be cautious, he replied. If the marshal in Silver Creek is determined enough, he might bring a tracker. The thought sent a chill through Victoria. How far is Fort Laramie? 3 days' ride, if we push it. Longer with Rusty carrying double. Victoria fell silent, contemplating what awaited her at the fort. Would the authorities there believe her story? Or would they simply send her back to Silver Creek to face what passed for justice there? And what of Brendan? He was risking much by helping her. Mr. Cole, she began hesitantly. Brendan, he corrected. Brendan, Victoria amended. I want you to know that I truly am innocent. I would understand if you doubt me. I don't, he interrupted. I've met enough liars in my time to recognize one. You're not lying about the murder. His certainty surprised her. How can you be so sure? Brendan was quiet for a moment. A guilty person would have a story prepared. Excuses, explanations. You're just telling it straight. Victoria hadn't considered that. Well, thank you for believing me. Few others did. People believe what's convenient, Brendan said, a note of bitterness in his voice. Especially in small towns. They rode in companionable silence for a time, the Wyoming landscape unfolding around them. The terrain was varied, rolling hills giving way to rocky outcroppings, patches of forest, and open grassland. Brendan chose their path carefully, staying within sight of landmarks but avoiding the main trails. By midday, the sun was beating down mercilessly. Victoria's mouth was dry, and she could feel sweat trickling down her back beneath her dress. Just as she was about to ask for a rest, Brendan guided Rusty toward a small copse of trees near a stream. "We'll stop here," he said. "Rest, Rusty, and get some water." He dismounted first, then reached up to help Victoria down. Her legs were stiff from the hours in the saddle, and her ankle protested sharply as she put weight on it. She stumbled, and Brendan caught her against his chest, his arms steadying her. For a moment, they stood frozen, faces inches apart. Victoria became acutely aware of the strength in his arms, the scent of leather and pine that clung to him, the intensity in his blue eyes as they met hers. Brendan cleared his throat and stepped back. "Careful," he said gruffly. "Find some shade. I'll tend to Rusty." Victoria limped to a tree and sank down gratefully in its shadow, watching as Brendan led the horse to the stream. There was an easy confidence in the way he moved, a man completely at home in this wild country. She wondered again about his story, what had brought him to this solitary life, what he was seeking in the Northern Territories. When Brendan returned, he carried their canteens, freshly filled from the stream. He handed one to Victoria, then sat a respectful distance away, his back against another tree. "Thank you," Victoria said, drinking deeply. The water was cool and sweet, the best she'd ever tasted. Not just for the water, for everything. Brendan nodded, his eyes scanning the horizon. "We should reach Baker's Station by nightfall. It's just a small trading post, but we can get supplies there." Victoria hesitated. "I have some money. Not much, but enough to pay for my share." "Keep your money," Brendan said. "You'll need it." "I won't be a charity case," Victoria insisted. "I've worked for my living since I was 16 years old. I don't expect handouts." Brendan's expression softened slightly. "It's not charity, Miss Hayes. Consider it a loan if that makes you feel better." Victoria wanted to argue further, but recognized the stubborn set of his jaw. "Very well. A loan, then, to be repaid as soon as I'm able." They rested for another hour, eating a simple lunch of jerky and hardtack that Brendan produced from his saddlebags. Victoria found herself studying him when he wasn't looking, the lines around his eyes that spoke of both laughter and hardship, the small scar that bisected his left eyebrow, the capable hands that were never still. "How long have you been on your own?" she asked finally. Brendan glanced at her, surprise flickering across his features. "A while," he said vaguely. "That's not an answer." A ghost of a smile touched his lips. "You ask a lot of questions." "I find you interesting," Victoria said honestly. Brendan looked away, focusing on repacking their supplies. 5 years, he said after a long moment. "Since the war ended." Victoria did the mental calculation. "You fought in the war between the states." He nodded once. "Union cavalry. When it was over, I came west." "No family?" she asked gently. "None left." His tone made it clear the subject was closed. Victoria respected his reticence. Everyone had parts of themselves they preferred to keep hidden, she certainly did. But there was something about Brendan Cole that made her want to know more, to understand what drove this solitary man who had risked himself to help a stranger. They continued their journey by early afternoon, Brendan again lifting Victoria onto Rusty's back before mounting behind her. She was more accustomed to his presence now, the solid warmth of him at her back almost comforting as they rode. The landscape gradually changed, becoming more rugged. In the distance, Victoria could see the dark smudge of mountains against the sky. The wind picked up, carrying the scent of pine and sage. "It's beautiful out here," she said softly. "It is," Brendan agreed. "Different from back east." "Is that where you're from originally?" "Pennsylvania." There was a note of something like wistfulness in his voice. "Coal country. My father worked the mines until the dust took his lungs." Victoria heard the undercurrent of old pain. "I'm sorry. It was a long time ago." "And your mother?" "Died when I was 12. Fever." Brendan's answers were terse. But Victoria sensed it wasn't from unwillingness to share so much as the difficulty of revisiting old wounds. My parents are gone too, she offered. That's why I came west. There was nothing left for me in Ohio after my mother passed. Brendan was quiet for a moment. It's not easy, being alone in the world. No, Victoria agreed. It isn't. The simple exchange created a tentative bridge between them, a recognition of shared experience, of the particular loneliness that came from having no family to return to. As the afternoon waned, Victoria noticed Brendan growing more alert, his gaze constantly scanning their surroundings. Once, he pulled Rusty to a halt, listening intently, before changing their direction slightly. Is something wrong? Victoria asked. Just being careful, Brendan replied. This is Cheyenne territory. Most are peaceful these days, but it's best not to take chances. Victoria felt a flutter of unease. Are we in danger? No more than usual out here. Brendan's tone was matter of fact. The Cheyenne have more reason to fear white settlers than we do them, truth be told. Victoria was surprised by his perspective. Most white men she'd encountered spoke of natives with fear or contempt. You don't seem worried. I've dealt with the Cheyenne before. They're honorable people if treated with respect. He adjusted his hat against the setting sun. It's men from your town I'm more concerned about. The reminder of her pursuers sent a chill through Victoria. Do you think they followed us? Hard to say. Depends how determined your marshal is. Brendan's arms tightened slightly around her as he urged Rusty to a faster pace. We'll reach Baker's station soon. We can rest there, get information. True to his word, as dusk settled over the land, the outline of a small cluster of buildings appeared in the distance. Baker's station was little more than a trading post with a few outbuildings, but to Victoria, it looked like salvation after their long day of riding. Brendan approached cautiously, circling around to observe the station from a distance before approaching. Victoria could see several horses tied up outside and lamplight glowing from the windows. Stay close to me, Brendan said as they rode in. Let me do the talking. He dismounted first, then helped Victoria down. Her legs nearly buckled after the long hours in the saddle, and Brendan kept a steadying hand at her elbow as they approached the main building. The trading post was a single large room with a counter at the back. Shelves lined the walls, stocked with supplies, canned goods, ammunition, tools, fabric. A pot-bellied stove in the center provided warmth, and around it sat several men playing cards. All conversation stopped as Victoria and Brendan entered. Victoria was acutely aware of her appearance, her torn, dirty dress, her disheveled hair, the bruise and cut on her temple. She felt the men's curious stares and instinctively moved closer to Brendan. The man behind the counter, a burly fellow with a full beard streaked with gray, raised an eyebrow at them. Evening, folks. What can I do for you? Need supplies, Brendan said casually. And a place to rest for the night, if you have it. The man eyed Victoria, taking in her condition. Got a lean-to out back for travelers. Not much, but it's shelter. His gaze returned to Brendan. $2 for the night, supplies extra. Brendan nodded and began listing what they needed: food, bandages for Victoria's ankle, coffee. As the shopkeeper gathered the items, Victoria became aware of a murmured conversation from the card players. One man in particular kept glancing their way, his expression calculating. Victoria tugged gently at Brendan's sleeve, tilting her head subtly toward the man. Brendan's expression didn't change, but she felt him tense beside her. We'll take those supplies now, Brendan said to the shopkeeper, placing coins on the counter. And some information, if you have it. Depends on what you're asking, the man replied, scooping up the money. Any trouble in these parts lately? Riders from the south, maybe? The shopkeeper paused, his eyes flickering between them. Had some men through earlier today, marshal and deputies from Silver Creek, looking for a woman. His gaze settled on Victoria. Didn't say what she looked like, but they seemed mighty determined. Victoria's heart sank. They were closer than she'd feared. Which way were they headed? Brendan asked casually. Northwest, toward the fort. The shopkeeper lowered his voice. They said she killed a man. That true? Before Victoria could speak, Brendan cut in smoothly. My wife and I are just passing through, heading to see her sister in Montana Territory. His hand moved to the small of Victoria's back, a gesture of intimacy that took her by surprise. Appreciate the information. The shopkeeper didn't look convinced, but he nodded and finished packing their supplies. Brendan took the bundle with one hand, keeping the other on Victoria's back as he guided her toward the door. They had almost reached it when the man who had been watching them stood up from the card table. "Hold up there," he called. Brendan turned slowly. "Something I can help you with." The man was medium height, with a weathered face and cold eyes. He wore no badge, but had the look of someone who'd ridden with a posse before. "Just wondering where you folks are coming from." "East," Brendan said shortly. "Heading west." "That's so." The man stepped closer. "Funny thing is, I heard about a woman running from Silver Creek. Blonde, pretty, killed a hotel owner." His eyes fixed on Victoria. "And here you are, looking like you've been through hell, with a mighty fine cut on your head." Victoria felt Brendan's hand move subtly toward his gun. "My wife had an accident on the trail," he said, his voice dangerously calm. "Now, if you'll excuse us, it's been a long day." The man's hand hovered near his own weapon. "I think maybe you should wait here. Marshall Holloway is offering a reward. Step aside." Brendan interrupted. "Whatever business you think you have with us, you're mistaken." The tension in the room was palpable. The card players had half risen from their seats, and the shopkeeper had disappeared behind the counter. "I ain't mistaken," the man insisted. "That's her. Victoria Hayes. Wanted for murder." At the sound of her name, Victoria's blood ran cold. Before she could react, Brendan moved with startling speed. In one fluid motion, he pushed Victoria behind him and drew his gun, aiming it steadily at the man's chest. "We're walking out that door," Brendan said, his voice quiet but carrying clearly in the silent room. "Anyone tries to stop us, they'll regret it." The man froze, his hand still hovering near his gun. For a tense moment, Victoria thought he might draw anyway, but something in Brendan's eyes must have convinced him otherwise. Slowly, he raised his hands. "This ain't over," he warned. "Marshall's got men all over this territory looking for her." "Then they can keep looking," Brendan said. He backed toward the door, keeping Victoria behind him, his gun never wavering. "Nobody follow us. I won't say it twice." They backed out of the trading post into the gathering darkness. Brendan kept his gun drawn as he guided Victoria swiftly to where Rusty was tethered. He helped her mount quickly, then swung up behind her, his movements urgent but controlled. "Hold tight," he murmured, and then they were galloping away from Baker's Station into the night. Victoria clung to the saddle horn, her heart pounding. "They know," she gasped. "They know I'm with you now." "They suspect," Brendan corrected grimly. "But they'll be certain soon enough. We need to find shelter elsewhere tonight." They rode hard for nearly an hour, Brendan pushing Rusty to his limits. The poor horse was lathered with sweat by the time Brendan finally slowed their pace, turning off the trail into a dense stand of trees. He dismounted quickly, helping Victoria down. "Wait here," he said, and disappeared into the darkness to scout the area. Victoria stood trembling beside Rusty, stroking his neck to calm him as much as herself. The night was eerily quiet, with only the occasional hoot of an owl or rustle of leaves in the wind. She had never felt so exposed, so vulnerable. When Brendan returned, his expression was grim. "There's a small hollow ahead, sheltered by rocks. We'll camp there tonight." They led Rusty deeper into the trees, to a natural depression surrounded by large boulders. It was well hidden, invisible from the trail they'd left behind. "No fire tonight," Brendan said as he unsaddled Rusty. "Too risky." Victoria nodded, hugging herself against the growing chill. Without a fire, the night would be cold, but it was a small price to pay for safety. Brendan arranged their bedrolls close together, then handed Victoria some jerky and hardtack from their supplies. They ate in silence, the weight of their situation hanging heavy between them. "I'm sorry," Victoria said finally. "I've brought nothing but trouble to you." Brendan looked at her, his face half hidden in shadow. "You didn't ask for any of this." "No, but you certainly didn't ask to become a fugitive alongside me." Victoria's voice caught. "That man at the trading post. He'll tell the marshal about you. They'll be hunting both of us now." "Let them hunt," Brendan said simply. "I've been hunted before." Victoria studied him in the darkness. "You're a very strange man, Brendan Cole." A soft chuckle escaped him. "So I've been told. Most men would have left me to fend for myself, or turned me in for the reward. I'm not most men." He stretched out on his bedroll, his rifle close at hand. "Get some sleep, Victoria. We leave at first light. Victoria settled onto her own bedroll, pulling the blanket tight around her. Despite her exhaustion, sleep seemed impossible with her mind racing. The events at Baker's Station had confirmed her worst fears. Marshall Holloway was determined to find her, and now Brendan was implicated as well. "Brendan," she whispered. What will we do when we reach Fort Laramie?" "If the marshal has sent word ahead." Brendan was quiet for a long moment. "There's a man at the fort, Captain Daniel Morrison. He's a fair man, someone I trust. If we can speak to him, explain what happened. And if we can't, then we keep moving." His voice was steady, reassuring. "One step at a time, Victoria. That's how you survive out here." Victoria lay awake long after Brendan's breathing had deepened into sleep. She watched the stars through gaps in the trees, feeling oddly suspended between worlds. Everything she had known, her life in Silver Creek, her job at the hotel, her tentative plans for the future, all of it was gone. In its place was this desperate flight across the wilderness with a man she barely knew. And yet, there was something about Brendan Cole that made her trust him implicitly. Perhaps it was the quiet competence with which he handled everything, or the unwavering way he had stood by her despite the danger to himself. Whatever it was, Victoria found herself grateful beyond words for his presence. Eventually, exhaustion overcame her racing thoughts, and she drifted into an uneasy sleep, dreaming of pursuit and gunfire and a pair of steady blue eyes that promised safety. Victoria woke to the touch of a hand on her shoulder. She startled, momentarily disoriented, before recognizing Brendan's silhouette in the pre-dawn light. "We need to move," he said quietly. "Now." The urgency in his voice brought her fully awake. "What is it? What's happened?" "I heard riders on the trail. 3, maybe 4. Brendan was already rolling up their bedding. "Could be coincidence, but I'm not taking chances." Victoria scrambled to her feet, ignoring the pain in her ankle as she helped Brendan pack their meager camp. Within minutes, they had Rusty saddled and were moving silently through the trees, away from the main trail. The sky was just beginning to lighten, casting the landscape in shades of gray and blue. Brendan led them through a series of ravines and dry creek beds, constantly changing direction. Victoria realized he was deliberately creating a confusing trail, making it difficult for anyone to follow. "Do you think it's them?" she asked as Brendan helped her mount Rusty. "Can't say for certain." He swung up behind her. "But there aren't many honest folk riding these parts before dawn. They kept to the rough country, avoiding open ground whenever possible." Brendan seemed to have an instinctive knowledge of the land, finding hidden paths through dense brush and rocky terrain. By mid-morning, they had covered several miles, though not in a straight line. Victoria's stomach growled loudly, reminding her they hadn't stopped for breakfast. Brendan heard it and chuckled softly. "We'll rest soon," he promised. "Need to find water for Rusty first." The sun was high when they finally stopped in a sheltered gully where a small spring bubbled up from the rocks. Rusty drank gratefully while Brendan helped Victoria dismount. "Your ankle?" he asked, noticing her wince. "Better, I think. Just stiff." Victoria stretched cautiously, her body aching from the hours in the saddle. "I've never ridden this much before." "You'll get used to it," Brendan said, then seemed to catch himself. "If we need to keep riding, that is." Victoria smiled faintly at his correction. "It's all right. I understand this isn't a temporary situation." Brendan busied himself with their supplies, avoiding her gaze. "We'll reach Fort Laramie tomorrow if we keep this pace. After that," he shrugged. "After that, we see if your Captain Morrison believes me," Victoria finished. She accepted the dried beef and hardtack Brendan offered. "And if he doesn't?" Brendan sat beside her, his own food untouched. "Then we have decisions to make." Victoria studied his profile, noting the determined set of his jaw. You've already done more than anyone could expect, Brendan. At the fort, you could walk away. Tell them I forced you to help me. No one would blame you." Brendan turned to her, his blue eyes intense. "Is that what you think I'd do? Abandon you? I think you're a good man who's already risked too much for a stranger," Victoria said softly. "I wouldn't hold it against you." "Well, I'd hold it against myself." Brendan's voice was gruff. "I don't start things I don't intend to finish, Victoria." The conviction in his words warmed something inside her. In the short time she'd known him, Brendan Cole had shown more integrity than most men she'd encountered in her entire life. "Thank you," she said simply. They ate in companionable silence, listening to the gentle gurgle of the spring and the occasional call of birds overhead. For a brief moment, Victoria could almost forget they were fugitives being hunted across the territory. There was a strange peace in this wild place, a freedom she had never experienced in the confines of town life. "Have you always lived in towns?" Brendan asked suddenly, as if reading her thoughts. Victoria nodded. "Small ones, mostly. My father was a schoolteacher before he died. After that, my mother and I moved around, following work. And you became a hotel maid in Silver Creek." "Assistant manager, actually," Victoria corrected with a small smile. "Though I did plenty of maid's work too, whatever needed doing." She plucked absently at the torn hem of her dress. "I was saving for my own place someday. Just a small boarding house, nothing fancy." Brendan listened attentively. "You'd be good at that." "Would I?" Victoria laughed softly. "How would you know? You're resourceful, brave." His eyes met hers. "And you haven't complained once, despite everything. That says something about a person." Victoria felt her cheeks warm at the unexpected praise. "Well, complaining wouldn't help much, would it? Doesn't stop most people." Brendan stood, offering his hand to help her up. "We should keep moving. Still have ground to cover before dark." Victoria placed her hand in his, noticing the strength in his grip, the calluses that spoke of years of hard work. As he pulled her to her feet, she found herself standing very close to him, close enough to see the flecks of gray in his blue eyes, the faint scar that ran along his jawline. For a moment, neither moved. Victoria became acutely aware of her heartbeat, of the warmth of his hand still holding hers. Then Brendan stepped back, clearing his throat. "I'll see to Rusty," he said, turning away. Victoria watched him go, a strange fluttering in her chest. She reminded herself sternly that their situation was temporary, a circumstance of necessity, not choice. Whatever she might be beginning to feel for Brendan Cole was irrelevant. Once they reached Fort Laramie, their paths would likely diverge. The thought brought an unexpected pang of sadness. They continued their journey through the afternoon, keeping to the difficult terrain that would slow any pursuers. Brendan remained vigilant, frequently stopping to listen or to study the landscape behind them. Though he said nothing to alarm her, Victoria could sense his growing tension. "They're still following, aren't they?" she asked as the sun began its descent toward the western horizon. Brendan's arm tightened slightly around her waist. "Maybe. Saw dust on the ridge about an hour back. Could be anyone." But they both knew it wasn't just anyone. Victoria's heart sank at the implications. "We won't make Fort Laramie by tomorrow, will we? Not if we have to keep hiding like this." "We'll make it," Brendan said firmly. "Might not be the direct route, but we'll get there." As dusk approached, they found themselves in increasingly rugged country, a maze of rock formations and steep ravines. Brendan guided Rusty expertly through the labyrinth until they reached a small box canyon, hidden from the main trails and accessible only through a narrow gap in the rocks. "We'll stop here for the night," he said, dismounting. "Good defensible position, if it comes to that." Victoria tried not to dwell on what, if it comes to that, might entail as she slid from the saddle into Brendan's waiting arms. For just a moment, he held her longer than necessary, his eyes searching hers with an unspoken question. Then he set her gently on her feet and turned to unsaddle Rusty. The canyon offered natural shelter. A small overhang in the rock wall would protect them from the elements, and the single entrance meant they couldn't be surprised from behind. A trickle of water ran down one wall, enough for their needs and for Rusty. "Can we risk a fire?" Victoria asked, rubbing her arms against the evening chill. Brendan considered the question. "A small one. The walls will hide most of the light, and we're far enough from the main trails." He gathered what sparse wood he could find and built a tiny fire beneath the overhang. The small flames cast dancing shadows on the rock walls, creating an oddly intimate atmosphere in their stone shelter. Victoria sat close to the fire, her back against the canyon wall. Brendan handed her some of their dwindling supplies, the last of the dried beef, a bit of hardtack, and a precious apple he'd been saving. "You should eat this," Victoria protested, trying to return the apple. "I got it for you," Brendan said, his voice gruff. "At Baker's Station." The simple gesture touched her deeply. It had been a long time since anyone had thought to get something special just for her. Victoria bit into the apple, savoring the sweet, crisp flesh. "Thank you," she said softly. "Would you like half?" Brendan shook his head, a small smile playing at the corners of his mouth as he watched her enjoy the fruit. "Worth it just to see you smile." The comment, so unexpected and gentle, caught Victoria off guard. She lowered the apple, studying Brendan's face in the firelight. "Why are you really helping me, Brendan?" she asked quietly. The truth this time. Brendan was silent for a long moment, poking at the small fire with a stick. When he finally spoke, his voice was low, almost as if he were speaking to himself. 5 years ago, I was riding with a scouting party near Chattanooga. We came across a woman, not much older than you. She'd been accused of spying for the Confederates, feeding information to her husband's regiment. He paused, his eyes fixed on the flames. The captain wanted to hang her on the spot. No trial, no evidence. Just an accusation. Victoria held her breath, sensing the weight of the story. I spoke up for her. Said we should take her back to camp, let the officers decide. Brendan's jaw tightened. Captain didn't like that. Ordered me to tie the rope myself. Said it would teach me about loyalty. What did you do? Victoria whispered. I refused. Brendan's eyes met hers across the fire, the flames reflecting in their blue depths. Got 5 lashes for insubordination. But while they were dealing with me, the woman escaped. Never knew what happened to her. And that's why you helped me? Because of her. Brendan shook his head slowly. Because I learned something that day. There's law, and there's justice, and sometimes they're not the same thing. He set aside the stick he'd been holding. When I saw you running, bleeding, being hunted like an animal, I couldn't just ride past. Not again. Victoria felt a lump form in her throat at the raw honesty in his voice. On impulse, she moved around the fire to sit beside him, close enough that their shoulders touched. Thank you for telling me, she said softly, and for being the kind of man who would take 5 lashes rather than hang an innocent woman. Brendan's expression softened as he looked at her. You should get some rest. Tomorrow will be another long day. But Victoria wasn't ready to end the moment. There was something building between them, a connection that went beyond their shared circumstance, beyond gratitude or obligation. In the flickering firelight, with the stars visible through the narrow opening of the canyon above, she felt brave enough to acknowledge it. I'm glad it was you who found me, Brendan Cole, she said quietly. Of all the campfires I could have stumbled upon that night, I'm glad it was yours. Brendan's hand found hers in the darkness, his calloused fingers intertwining with her smaller ones. So am I, he murmured. They sat like that for a long time, hands clasped, watching the small fire burn down to embers. No more words were needed, the simple touch spoke volumes. A promise of something neither was ready to name, but both could feel growing stronger with each passing hour. Eventually, exhaustion overtook them. They arranged their bedrolls side by side beneath the overhang, closer than they had been previous nights. As Victoria drifted toward sleep, she felt Brendan's hand reach for hers once more, a reassuring warmth in the cool night air. Her last conscious thought was that no matter what awaited them at Fort Laramie, something had changed irrevocably between them. And for the first time since fleeing Silver Creek, Victoria felt a glimmer of hope for what the future might hold. The sound of a gunshot jerked Victoria from sleep, her heart hammering against her ribs. Beside her, Brendan was already on his feet, rifle in hand, his expression grim in the gray light of dawn. Stay down, he ordered, moving to the entrance of the canyon. Victoria scrambled to her knees, trying to make sense of what was happening. Is it them? She whispered. Brendan nodded once, his attention focused on the narrow gap in the rocks. 3 riders. They found our trail. Cold fear washed over Victoria. After everything, after all their caution, they had been discovered. What do we do? We hold here, Brendan said, his voice steady despite the danger. This position gives us the advantage. They can only come through one at a time. Victoria crawled to where their packs lay, retrieving Brendan's revolver. Here, she said, offering it to him. Brendan glanced at her in surprise. You keep it, he said. You know how to use it? My father taught me. Before he died. Victoria checked the cylinder, finding it fully loaded. The weight of the gun was both frightening and reassuring in her hands. Another shot rang out, closer this time, followed by a man's voice calling, Cole. We know you're in there. Send out the woman, and you can ride away. Brendan's expression hardened. That'll be the day, he muttered. You don't have to do this, Victoria said, moving to his side. This is my fight, not yours. Brendan looked at her, something fierce and protective in his gaze. It became my fight the moment I decided to help you, he said simply. Then, louder, he called out to their pursuers. There's no need for bloodshed. The woman is innocent. A harsh laugh answered him. That's for the judge to decide. Last chance, Cole. They're not going to listen, Victoria said quietly. No, Brendan agreed. Get Rusty ready. If things go badly, you ride out the back way. He nodded toward a narrow gap in the rocks at the far end of the canyon, barely visible, but just wide enough for a horse and rider. I'm not leaving you, Victoria protested. Brendan's blue eyes locked with hers, intense and unwavering. Yes, you are, if it comes to it. His voice softened. Promise me, Victoria. Before she could answer, a bullet ricocheted off the rocks near the entrance, sending fragments flying. Brendan pulled Victoria down behind a boulder, shielding her with his body. That's their answer, he said grimly. Stay low. The next few minutes were a blur of gunfire and shouted threats. Brendan returned fire sparingly, making each shot count. Victoria crouched behind him, the revolver clutched in her trembling hands, listening to the chaos and praying silently for deliverance. During a momentary lull, Brendan turned to her. I think I've hit one of them, but they're positioning themselves for a rush. His face was streaked with dust and sweat, his eyes bright with determination. Victoria, listen to me. When I give the word, you get on Rusty and go. Follow the creek bed north for about 5 miles. It'll lead you to the main trail to Fort Laramie. Not without you, Victoria insisted, her voice breaking. I'll be right behind you, Brendan promised, though they both knew it might be a lie. But you have to go first. A fresh volley of gunfire punctuated his words. Brendan returned fire, then ducked back down as bullets pinged off the rocks around them. 3 shots left, he muttered, checking his rifle. Make them count. Victoria's heart pounded painfully in her chest. This couldn't be happening, not after everything they'd been through. Not when she was just beginning to realize how much Brendan had come to mean to her. Brendan, she began, not sure what she wanted to say, only knowing she needed to say something before it was too late. He turned to her, his expression softening for just a moment. Then, impulsively, he leaned forward and pressed his lips to hers in a brief, fierce kiss that left her breathless. For luck, he murmured as he pulled away. Now go. Get Rusty ready. Stunned by the kiss, Victoria moved automatically to where Rusty stood nervously at the back of the canyon. Her mind was racing, her lips still tingling from Brendan's touch. She couldn't leave him, she wouldn't. As she reached Rusty, a sudden commotion erupted at the canyon entrance, shouts, the thunder of hooves, and gunfire that didn't seem to be directed at them. Victoria froze, her hand on Rusty's bridle, as Brendan moved cautiously toward the entrance, his rifle raised. What's happening? She called softly. Not sure, Brendan replied, his posture tense. Someone else has joined the party. For several tense minutes, they waited, listening to the sounds of conflict outside the canyon. Then, unexpectedly, a voice called out, Hello, the canyon. Is there a Brendan Cole in there? Brendan and Victoria exchanged startled glances. The voice was unfamiliar, but it didn't sound hostile. Who's asking? Brendan called back cautiously. Captain Daniel Morrison, Fort Laramie, came the reply. Are you Cole? Victoria saw Brendan's shoulders relax slightly at the name. Daniel? That you? In the flesh. Come on out, Brendan. It's safe now. Still wary, Brendan motioned for Victoria to stay back as he moved toward the entrance. He peered around the rocks, then lowered his rifle, a look of disbelief crossing his face. All clear, he said to Victoria, extending his hand to her. Heart pounding, Victoria joined him at the canyon entrance. Outside, the scene was one of controlled chaos. 3 men lay on the ground, disarmed and under guard by uniformed soldiers. A tall man on horseback, presumably Captain Morrison, was giving orders to his men. When he saw Brendan, Morrison dismounted and strode forward, hand extended. Brendan Cole. Been a few years. Brendan clasped the offered hand. Daniel, your timing is impeccable. Morrison grinned. Always did have a flair for dramatic entrances. His gaze shifted to Victoria, taking in her disheveled appearance and the revolver still clutched in her hand. And this must be the notorious murderer from Silver Creek. Victoria stiffened, but Brendan's hand found hers, squeezing reassuringly. "This is Victoria Hayes," he said firmly. "And she's innocent of the charges against her." Morrison studied Victoria thoughtfully. "So I've been hearing. That's why we're here, actually." "What do you mean?" Victoria asked, hardly daring to hope. Morrison gestured for them to follow him away from the prisoners. When they were out of earshot, he explained, 3 days ago, a man rode into Fort Laramie, half dead from a gunshot wound. Before he died, he confessed to killing Jacob Ellsworth in Silver Creek." Victoria gasped, her free hand flying to her mouth. "Who was he?" "Name was Thomas Gentry. Apparently, he was Mrs. Ellsworth's lover." Morrison's expression was grim. "According to his deathbed confession, they planned to kill Ellsworth together, then blame it on you, Miss Hayes. But something went wrong. Gentry panicked, stabbed Ellsworth earlier than planned. Mrs. Ellsworth stuck to the plan anyway, accused you." Victoria felt lightheaded, the implications washing over her. "Then, I'm cleared. The charges are dropped. As soon as we verify Gentry's story, yes." Morrison nodded. "I've already sent men to Silver Creek to arrest Mrs. Ellsworth and inform the authorities there." Tears of relief sprang to Victoria's eyes. After everything, the terror, the flight, the constant fear, it was over. She was innocent, and now everyone would know it. Brendan's arm came around her shoulders, steadying her. "Thank you, Daniel," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "We owe you." Morrison waved off the thanks. "When I heard Brendan Cole was involved, I figured there was more to the story." He smiled slightly. "You always did have a knack for finding trouble, Cole." "Or trouble for finding me," Brendan replied. Morrison turned serious again. "These men will face charges for attempted murder. They had no authority to pursue you across territorial lines, especially after we'd sent word about Gentry's confession." He shook his head in disgust. "Bounty hunters, the lot of them. More interested in the reward money than justice." Victoria looked at the captured men, recognizing one as the man from Baker's Station. The realization of how close they'd come to being killed sent a shudder through her. "What happens now?" she asked, looking between Morrison and Brendan. "Now," Morrison said, "we get you both to Fort Laramie. You can rest, recover, give your official statements." He glanced at Brendan. "After that, I suppose it's up to you." "Up to you." The words hung in the air, full of possibilities and questions. Victoria looked up at Brendan, uncertain what to say or ask. Their entire acquaintance had been defined by crisis, by the desperate flight from Silver Creek. With that gone, what remained between them? Brendan met her gaze, something warm and steady in his blue eyes. "First things first," he said softly. "Let's get to the fort." The journey to Fort Laramie was almost anticlimactic after their harrowing days on the run. Captain Morrison and his men provided an escort, the captured bounty hunters securely bound and under guard. Victoria rode Rusty, with Brendan walking alongside, his hand never far from the saddle, as if reluctant to break the connection between them. They arrived at the fort by midday, a sprawling complex of buildings surrounded by a high wooden wall. Soldiers moved purposefully about their duties, while civilians went about their business in the small settlement that had grown up around the military outpost. Morrison led them to the officers' quarters, where he arranged for Victoria to have a small private room. "It's not much," he apologized, "but it's clean and safe." "It's perfect," Victoria assured him, overcome with gratitude at the simple luxuries of real bed, privacy, safety. "Get some rest," Morrison advised. "We'll talk more later." When Morrison had gone, Brendan lingered in the doorway of Victoria's room, suddenly awkward in a way he hadn't been during their days together in the wilderness. "You should rest," he said, echoing Morrison's words. Victoria nodded, though rest was the furthest thing from her mind. There was so much to say, so much to ask, but exhaustion was catching up with her, the adrenaline of the past days finally ebbing away. Will you still be here when I wake up?" she asked, hating the vulnerability in her voice, but needing to know. Brendan's expression softened. "Yes," he promised. "I'll be here." It was enough for now. Victoria watched him go, then sank onto the narrow bed, overwhelmed by the events of the past few days. Despite her racing thoughts, she fell into a deep, dreamless sleep almost immediately. When she woke, the sun was setting, casting long shadows through the small window of her room. Someone had left a tray of food, simple army fare, but hot and plentiful, and a basin of clean water. Beside it lay a folded dress, plain but clean and whole. Victoria washed gratefully, scrubbing away the dirt and fear of the past days. The dress was a bit large, but felt wonderful after days in her torn and filthy clothing. She combed her hair with her fingers, wishing for a proper brush, and did her best to make herself presentable. A soft knock at the door made her heart leap. "Come in," she called. It was Captain Morrison, not Brendan, who entered. "Miss Hayes," he greeted her formally. "I hope you're feeling better." "Much, thank you." Victoria tried to hide her disappointment. "Has there been news from Silver Creek?" Morrison nodded, his expression grave but satisfied. "Meredith Ellsworth is in custody. She's confessed to her part in her husband's murder and to framing you." He smiled slightly. It seems Thomas Gentry wasn't her only lover. The whole scheme was unraveling even before we arrived. Relief washed over Victoria. "Then it's truly over? I'm free to go." "You are," Morrison confirmed, "though you might want to consider your options carefully. Silver Creek may not be the most welcoming place for you now, despite your innocence." Victoria hadn't thought that far ahead. In truth, she had no desire to return to Silver Creek, not after what had happened there. But where would she go? What would she do? Her dreams of owning a boarding house seemed impossibly distant now. "Thank you for your concern," she said politely. "I'll need time to consider my next steps." Morrison nodded, then hesitated. "There's something else you should know. Brendan rode out about an hour ago." Victoria's heart sank. "He left? But he said he'd be here." "He'll be back," Morrison assured her. "Said he had something important to attend to. Asked me to tell you he'd return by morning." Though relieved, Victoria couldn't help feeling a pang of hurt. After everything they'd been through, after that kiss in the canyon, she had hoped. What? That Brendan would declare himself? That they would ride off into the sunset together? It seemed foolish now. "Thank you for telling me," she said, keeping her voice steady. Morrison studied her for a moment, then said gently, "Brendan Cole is a good man, Miss Hayes. One of the best I've known. But he carries his own burdens, his own ghosts." He moved toward the door. "Give him time." After Morrison left, Victoria sat on the edge of the bed, turning his words over in her mind. Ghosts. Yes, she had sensed them in Brendan, the shadows that sometimes darkened his eyes, the reticence about his past. Whatever had happened to him during and after the war had left scars deeper than the visible ones he carried. She ate the meal that had been left for her, though she hardly tasted it. As night fell, she found herself standing at the small window, looking out at the fort's courtyard, illuminated by scattered lanterns. Somewhere out there, beyond the walls, Brendan Cole was riding through the darkness on some unknown errand. Would he truly return, as Morrison had said? And if he did, what then? Their time together had been intense, compressed by danger and necessity. What would remain between them in the clear light of normal life? Victoria slept fitfully, her dreams a confused jumble of running, hiding, and searching for something or someone she couldn't quite find. She woke at dawn, momentarily disoriented by the unfamiliar surroundings before remembering she was safe at Fort Laramie. After washing and dressing, she ventured out into the courtyard, nodding politely to the soldiers and civilians she passed. The fort was already bustling with morning activities, horses being groomed, supplies unloaded, meals prepared. Victoria found her way to the mess hall, where she was served a hearty breakfast of eggs, bacon, and biscuits. She ate alone, keenly aware of the curious glances cast her way. Word of her arrival with the patrol had clearly spread throughout the fort. As she was finishing her meal, Captain Morrison appeared at her table. "Miss Hayes," he greeted her. "I hope you slept well." "Well enough, thank you," Victoria replied. She hesitated, then asked the question foremost in her mind. "Has Brendan returned?" Morrison's expression gave nothing away. "Not yet, but there's someone who'd like to speak with you, if you're willing." Puzzled, Victoria followed Morrison to his office, a small but tidy room filled with maps and official-looking documents. To her surprise, a familiar figure awaited them, Marshal Holloway from Silver Creek. Victoria instinctively stepped back, her hand going to her throat. This was the man who had struck her, who had been ready to hang her without a trial. "It's all right," Morrison said quickly. "Marshall Holloway is here to officially clear your name and to offer an apology." Holloway looked distinctly uncomfortable, his normally florid face pale and drawn. "Miss Hayes," he began stiffly, "I've come to inform you that all charges against you have been dropped. Mrs. Ellsworth has confessed to her part in framing you for her husband's murder." Victoria said nothing, waiting. Holloway cleared his throat. "I also owe you an apology. I acted hastily, without proper investigation." He couldn't quite meet her eyes. "The town council has authorized me to offer you compensation for your wrongful treatment. $500. The amount was substantial, more than Victoria had ever possessed at one time. It would be enough to start over somewhere new, perhaps even enough for a down payment on a small property. "I appreciate the gesture, Marshall," she said coolly. "But money cannot erase what happened." "No, madam, it cannot," Holloway agreed, looking genuinely chastened. "For what it's worth, I am truly sorry." Victoria studied him, seeing not the fearsome figure who had driven her from town, but a fallible man who had made a grievous error in judgment. "I accept your apology," she said finally. "And the compensation." Relief crossed Holloway's face. He produced an envelope from his coat pocket and placed it on Morrison's desk. "It's all there. $500. He hesitated. "Your possessions from the hotel have been packed up. They're with my deputy outside." Victoria nodded, suddenly overwhelmed by the rapid reversal of her fortunes. Yesterday, she had been a fugitive, hunted, and desperate. Today, she was exonerated, compensated, and free to go wherever she pleased. After Holloway left, Morrison handed her the envelope. "A new start," he observed. "Yes," Victoria agreed, though she felt oddly hollow. She had her freedom, her reputation, even the means to pursue her dreams. But Brendan had not returned, and without him, her victory seemed incomplete. Morrison seemed to read her thoughts. "Brendan Cole is a man of his word," he said gently. "If he said he'd return, he will." Victoria managed a smile. "Of course. Thank you, Captain Morrison, for everything." She spent the rest of the morning collecting her possessions, the small trunk of clothing and personal items from Silver Creek, brought by Holloway's deputy. It was strange to see these remnants of her old life, to hold her mother's silver-backed hairbrush again, to touch the few books she'd treasured. By midday, there was still no sign of Brendan. Victoria tried to quell her growing anxiety, reminding herself that distances were vast in this territory, that any number of innocent delays could have held him up. She was sitting on a bench in the fort's small garden, trying to decide what to do next, when she heard hoofbeats approaching. Looking up, she saw Brendan riding through the fort's main gate, Rusty's familiar form followed by a second horse laden with supplies. Victoria's heart leapt at the sight of him. He looked tired but unharmed, his face bearing the dust of the trail. As he dismounted and handed Rusty's reins to a waiting stable boy, his eyes scanned the courtyard, clearly searching for someone. For her. Victoria rose from the bench, suddenly shy. What would she say to him? What could she say that would encompass everything she felt? Then Brendan saw her, and a smile transformed his weathered face. He strode toward her with purpose, his long legs covering the distance between them in moments. "Victoria," he said simply, stopping before her. "You came back," she replied, unable to keep the wonder from her voice. "I said I would." Brendan's blue eyes studied her face, as if memorizing every feature. "You look better. Rested." "I am." Victoria gestured to her clean dress, her neatly arranged hair. "Almost respectable again." "You were always respectable," Brendan said quietly, "even covered in trail dust and running for your life." Victoria smiled at that. "I heard about Marshall Holloway. The charges have been dropped. And they've compensated me." She hesitated. "I'm free to go wherever I choose." Something flickered in Brendan's eyes, concern, perhaps, or uncertainty. "That's good news," he said. "You deserve a fresh start." "Yes." Victoria waited, hoping he would say more, would give some indication of what he wanted or felt. When he remained silent, she asked, "Where did you go last night?" Brendan glanced toward the horses, the second one still laden with supplies. "I had some things to take care of. Preparations to make." "Preparations?" Brendan took a deep breath, as if gathering his courage. "Victoria, there's something I need to ask you." He reached into his pocket and withdrew a small object, holding it carefully in his palm. But first, I need to show you something. Victoria looked down at his outstretched hand. Lying there was a simple gold band, a ring, plain but beautifully crafted. Brendan? She whispered, her heart suddenly racing. It was my mother's, he explained, his voice low and earnest. The only thing of hers I kept, all these years. He met her eyes steadily. I've been carrying it with me, waiting. Though I didn't know what I was waiting for. Until I found you. Victoria's breath caught in her throat. What are you saying? I'm saying that I rode out yesterday to look at a piece of land. A homestead site, about 15 miles north of here. Brendan's voice grew more confident as he spoke. Good water, good grazing. Room to build. Room to grow. A homestead, Victoria repeated, hardly daring to believe what she was hearing. For us, Brendan confirmed. If you want it. If you want. Me. He held the ring between his fingers now, offering it to her. I know it's sudden. I know we've only known each other a few days. But sometimes, a few days is all it takes to know what matters. Tears sprang to Victoria's eyes, blurring her vision. Brendan Cole, she said, her voice trembling with emotion. Are you asking me to marry you? I am. His eyes never left hers. I love you, Victoria Hayes. I think I've loved you since I saw you standing at the edge of my campfire, brave and determined despite everything. I want to build a life with you, if you'll have me. Victoria's heart felt too full to contain her joy. This man, this good, honorable, steadfast man loved her, wanted to make a life with her. It seemed impossible, miraculous. Yes, she said, the word emerging as a half laugh, half sob. Yes, I'll have you, Brendan Cole. Brendan's face broke into a smile so radiant it transformed him, erasing the lines of care and worry. He slipped the ring onto her finger. It was a little loose, but neither of them cared, and then he was pulling her into his arms, his lips finding hers in a kiss that held all the promise of their future together. When they finally broke apart, breathless and laughing, Victoria noticed they had drawn an audience. Captain Morrison stood nearby, arms crossed, a knowing smile on his face. Several soldiers and civilians had paused in their activities to watch the unexpected romance unfolding in their midst. Seems we've caused a spectacle, Victoria murmured, blushing. Let them look, Brendan said, his arm still around her waist. I'm proud to have you on my arm, Mrs. Cole-to-be. The name sent a thrill through Victoria. Mrs. Cole, a new name, a new life, a new beginning with the man who had risked everything to save her. When? She asked, suddenly practical. When will we be married? As soon as you like, Brendan replied. There's a preacher here at the fort. Or we can wait, if you prefer. Victoria thought of the homestead Brendan had described, of the life they would build together. Why wait to begin it? Today, she decided firmly. If the preacher is willing. Brendan's eyebrows rose in surprise, but his smile widened. Today it is. They were married that evening in the fort's small chapel, a simple ceremony witnessed by Captain Morrison and a few others. Victoria wore the best dress from her trunk, a blue calico that brought out the color of her eyes. Brendan had somehow procured a clean shirt and had even trimmed his beard for the occasion. When the preacher pronounced them man and wife, and Brendan kissed her with gentle reverence, Victoria felt a sense of rightness, of coming home, that she had never experienced before. The fort's residents threw together a modest celebration, music from a fiddle and harmonica, simple food, and heartfelt congratulations from people who had been strangers just days before. As the evening wore on, Brendan led Victoria away from the festivities, to a quiet spot near the fort's wall where they could see the stars coming out over the vast Wyoming landscape. Happy? He asked, his arm around her shoulders. More than I can say, Victoria replied, leaning into his embrace. It's all happened so fast. A week ago, I was just a hotel manager in Silver Creek. Now I'm a married woman, about to start a homestead. Having second thoughts? Brendan's tone was light, but Victoria heard the underlying concern. She turned in his arms to face him, her hands coming up to frame his face. Not one, she said firmly. Sometimes, life gives you exactly what you need, exactly when you need it. You were my rescue, Brendan Cole. My safe harbor when everything else was lost. Brendan covered her hands with his own. And you were mine, he said softly. I'd been wandering so long, Victoria, looking for something I couldn't name. until I lit that fire and waited, and you came walking out of the darkness." Victoria smiled at the memory how terrified she had been, how uncertain of her reception. "Do you think it was fate? That we were meant to find each other?" "I don't know about fate," Brendan said thoughtfully. "But I do know that some things are worth waiting for. And you, Victoria Cole, were worth every moment of waiting." They left Fort Laramie the next morning, their horses loaded with supplies for their new home. Captain Morrison and several others saw them off, wishing them well on their journey. "Come back and visit," Morrison called as they rode out. "Don't be strangers." Brendan lifted a hand in acknowledgement, then turned to Victoria, riding beside him on a gentle mare they'd purchased with part of her compensation money. "Ready for this adventure, Mrs. Cole?" Victoria smiled, feeling the warmth of the morning sun on her face and the promise of their future stretching before them like the open country. "More than ready, Mr. Cole." As they rode north toward their homestead, Victoria thought about the strange, winding path that had brought her here. The tragedy in Silver Creek, the desperate flight, the campfire where a solitary cowboy had waited with an open heart. What had seemed like the end of everything had become a beginning instead. She nudged her horse closer to Brendan's, reaching out to touch his hand. He turned to her, his blue eyes crinkling at the corners as he smiled, that special smile he seemed to reserve just for her. "I love you," Victoria said, the words still new and wonderful on her tongue. "And I love you," Brendan replied simply. "Always will." Together, they rode toward home. 6 months later, Victoria stood on the porch of their newly completed cabin, watching as Brendan worked with the young colt in the corral nearby. The homestead had taken shape quickly under their combined efforts, a solid log cabin with 2 rooms and a stone fireplace, a small barn for the horses, and the milk cow they'd acquired, a vegetable garden that had yielded well in its first season. Winter was approaching, but they were ready for it. The root cellar was stocked with vegetables, the smokehouse filled with venison and beef. Brendan had proven to be an excellent hunter and an even better farmer, his careful planning ensuring they would want for nothing during the cold months ahead. Victoria rested her hand on her gently rounded stomach, feeling the first fluttering movements of the child they had created together. They had decided to wait until spring to announce the pregnancy, but privately, they had already begun discussing names. A boy would be James, after Brendan's father. A girl would be Eleanor, after Victoria's mother. Life wasn't perfect, there were still hardships, still challenges to face. The nearest neighbors were 5 miles away, the nearest town a full day's ride. Sometimes Victoria missed the bustle of town life, the simple convenience of a store just down the street. But those moments were fleeting. For every small sacrifice, there were countless joys: the beauty of the land they were taming together, the deep satisfaction of building something that would last, the profound bond that grew stronger between them with each passing day. Brendan looked up from his work with the colt, catching sight of Victoria on the porch. He smiled and waved, then said something to the young man working alongside him, Thomas, the 16-year-old son of their nearest neighbors, who had become something of an apprentice to Brendan. As Brendan strode toward the cabin, Victoria felt the familiar warmth in her chest at the sight of him. 6 months of marriage had only deepened her love, revealing new facets of the man she had pledged her life to. "Taking a break?" she called as he approached. "Thought I'd check on my wife," Brendan replied, climbing the porch steps to stand beside her. His hand joined hers on her stomach. "And the little one? How are you feeling?" "Wonderful," Victoria said honestly. "The morning sickness has passed, and I have more energy now." Brendan's expression was tender as he bent to kiss her, his lips warm despite the autumn chill in the air. "Good, because we have visitors coming." Victoria raised an eyebrow in surprise. "Visitors? Who?" "Captain Morrison and his wife," Brendan said. "They're making a tour of the settlements in the area. Should arrive tomorrow." "Tomorrow," Victoria exclaimed, mentally cataloging all that needed to be done. "I'll need to prepare the guest room, bake bread, perhaps slaughter one of the chickens." Brendan chuckled, wrapping his arms around her. "They're not expecting a hotel, love. Just our company." Victoria leaned into his embrace, breathing in the familiar scent of him, leather and pine and honest work. "I know. I just want everything to be perfect." "It will be," Brendan assured her. He looked out over their homestead, pride evident in his expression. "We've done well here, Victoria." "We have," she agreed softly. They stood together in comfortable silence, watching as the afternoon sun cast long shadows across their land. In the corral, Thomas was still working with the colt, his movements confident under Brendan's tutelage. In the garden, the last of the autumn vegetables waited to be harvested. From the barn came the gentle lowing of the cow, ready for her evening milking. It was a good life, not the one Victoria had imagined for herself back in Silver Creek, but infinitely better. A life built on trust and love, on mutual respect and shared dreams. "Do you ever think about it?" she asked suddenly. "That night when I stumbled into your camp." Brendan's arms tightened around her. "Often," he admitted. "I thank God every day that I decided to make camp where I did, that I lit that fire that guided you to me." Victoria turned in his embrace to face him, her hands coming up to rest against his chest. "I was so afraid," she remembered, "running blindly, certain I would die in the wilderness. And I was so alone," Brendan said quietly. "Not just that night, but for years before, wandering without purpose, without hope. And now," Victoria prompted, though she knew the answer. Brendan's smile was slow and sure, his blue eyes bright with love as they met hers. "Now I have everything I never dared to dream of. A home, a wife who amazes me every day, a child on the way." He brushed a strand of hair from her face, his touch infinitely gentle. "A future worth fighting for." Victoria rose on tiptoe to kiss him, pouring all her love and gratitude into the gesture. When they parted, she whispered against his lips, "Thank you for waiting with an open heart." "Always," Brendan promised, holding her close as the sun dipped toward the western horizon, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson. "Always." And as darkness fell over their homestead, a single light glowed in the window of their cabin, a beacon of warmth and welcome, much like the campfire that had brought them together on that fateful night when a desperate woman had been chased from town at sundown, and a solitary cowboy had been there to receive her with open arms and an open heart. It was not the end of their story, but rather the middle of a much larger one, a story of love and courage, of second chances and new beginnings. A story that would continue for many years to come, through all the joys and sorrows, challenges and triumphs that life would bring their way. For Victoria and Brendan Cole, it was just the beginning.